All right, we're live.
Sure.
Well, welcome everyone to the Android meetup for the GDG Silicon Slopes. And today we've got a presentation by Caden Wilkinson on Under the Hood of React Native. And first, we're going to talk about working from home that we're all experiencing with this COVID-19 situation. And here to talk about that situation, we've got John and Jennifer Mulholland. And so I'll pass it on to them.
Okay, so I started working totally from home over a year ago at the previous company I was working for. And there are just some things that are important. One thing that's really important to do is make sure you're going out and connecting with people. Now, you can't do that right now, but that's just one of those things like I live next door to my church, and I was part of a symphony orchestra, and would go to this meetup along with software craftsmanship meetup. So connecting with other people is important. Now, you can't do that as easily right now, but there are some things you can do. You can do online meetups like this and video chats. I actually did a lunch yesterday with a friend where we just connected on Google Hangouts and talked. Every week, my siblings and parents talk on Google Hangouts. So those are pretty easy things to set up. One other thing that's important, it really is to disconnect. It's easy to have your device on, have Slack on, or whatever thing you're using, and have that on. So you're getting interrupted early morning into the evening. There's ways to control those, and make a deal with your team. Say you're in charge of your own notifications. If you're done working, then don't respond and turn off your notifications. That way you actually get time away from work.
It also helps for the family members, spouses, kids, whatever, to know that these hours are going to be work hours and these hours are going to be off work hours, so that we can plan around that, and so we know when to leave the office area alone or be more quiet. So from a family perspective, from a spouse perspective, that's really helpful to know when they're going to be having set, or when you're going to have set hours.
Yeah, I'm trying to stick with set hours as you can, be consistent as much as you can. One thing, for me, I don't really care too much usually if someone walks in on a meeting, but some people get embarrassed. So if you can't let people know when you're going to be in meetings, you can't always do that because there's a lot of impromptu meetings. Like someone had to review a pull request and took half an hour or so today at least. And so you can't always do that, but do the best you can there. One thing that I found also to be important is you're going to have a set of rules about what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, and then review those with somebody. Especially if you find yourself getting distracted a lot, find ways. There's apps like Forest, which will yell at you if you go and use certain apps on your phone, or rescue time or whatever. But you can go and work with somebody. You can work with your spouse, partner, or even a roommate, or even someone totally different. I suggest not doing it with someone you work with, unless you get really good friendship, just because you want to be open and whatnot with that. Both of you seen?
One that John did that I thought was really helpful was he talked to the family and said that he wouldn't be storing food in the office and he wouldn't be eating at his desk. He'd be coming out for meals. So like when the kids were home all summer, he would come out and have lunch with us, step away from the desk, step away from work just for a little bit, and then go back in. And the kids knew they'd have that time that they could talk to him if they needed to, or, and it kept it more of a work life separation, so that he didn't get pulled into work and we never saw him again.
Yeah. One other thing real quick is to go and set up one-on-ones with people at work. I was actually surprised how much people appreciated this, because like they felt like they were chosen by someone, you know, like you must really like them to want to set up a one-on-one and really be interested in them. And it's a good opportunity to really get to know the person, you know, learn about them, and learn about you, so you understand each other better. It tends to make things go more smoothly. Usually you can do that in an office, or you know, you go down, you're in the cafeteria together, you go get, you know, soda together or something. But you can't really do that. And when I was at Ancestry, actually my solo walks turn into group walks eventually, you know, over time. And thanks, Sushil. And we go and chat, but it's harder to do from home. But you can do it though. You can go set up those one-on-ones, and you can even set up team celebrations. There's some online tips. This is not a new thing of working from home, but it's yeah, a lot of good things. You know, anything else? Yeah, it takes some time to get used to it. My wife here likes to have her personal space, and felt like getting invaded, you know, when I'm always home, because she didn't have that time home alone anymore. But you know, take some patience, and you get more used to it over time. The change can be hard for people, but give it some time, and reach out to people if you have questions. You know, feel free to reach out to me. I'm on the Slack channel, the Android Slack. So yeah, I think that's it for now.
Yeah, those are good. Those are great ideas. So one question I had was, do you find yourself making yourself checklists very often for things that you need to get done, since you're not having face-to-face interactions as much?
So yes and no. When the job is going good and predictable, you can make checklists, right? But when the job is not going predictable, those checklists, they just fall by the wayside. You know, I mean, you go say, okay, I want to do these 10 things today, and maybe like ritualistic things, like spend 10 minutes cleaning your desk. Put those on there. Make sure you go out for a break. Put that on your list. But sometimes I just don't know what I'm going to be doing during the day. You know, like I spent, I'd say, closer to an hour on that pull request today. Didn't anticipate it, and you know, I'm new at the job. I'm working for the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints right now, and still catching up on a lot of their Android stuff, because they love bleeding edge stuff. So it's taking a little bit of time to catch up. So I don't know how long things are going to take, and you know, I submit a pull request and get plenty of comments back to help me improve. You know, especially to do it the style they want. I don't know. I can't quantify that as well. It's hard to predict, but hopefully, you know, a lot of you guys are in stable situations that you can predict. One thing I do is actually I copy previous days, put it over, and then when I reported for stand up, I just use the previous day's column. Every day I just replace it, make a new one. So
I did think of a couple other things too. When he told us when specific meetings were going to be, that was really helpful for me. Like, he had a stand-up meeting every morning at around the same time. So then I just planned my exercising with a friend during that time, so that I didn't have to even worry about being home and making the wrong noises. And then when I was trying to work on the computer at the same time in a room, it made it a little more difficult if he was having a meeting and it was getting, you know, loud, a lot of people talking. And so I actually ended up most of the time when I was on a computer working on stuff in a different room, because it was easier for me to feel comfortable not being right up close to his meeting and, you know, trying to push that out of my mind while I was working. So
yeah,
but it's about finding what works for you, I think.
And even if you use headphones, the family's going to hear the workplace drama.
That's true.
Yeah. Yeah, my wife heard plenty of the workplace drama from my last job. But yeah, so just realize that and be open and talk about things. So.
And it's okay to try something, and if it's not working, change how you do it. We changed quite a few things. So
we talk about every Sunday we go on a walk, our usual walk that we do, and talk about things. And this was one of the sticky topics. Every week we talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think having that routine and communicating with your team remotely is very good. Because I found that helpful myself.
Yeah, can you hear me? I was going to add something.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, one thing, I worked from home for 2.5 years. I actually lived down in St. George, and I was working for companies up here in Lehigh. And some of the things that really helped me is keeping a daily routine, because like normally when you're going to the office, you have kind of this routine of getting ready for the day, getting in your car, driving somewhere, and then coming home. There's kind of like this clean separation, like we talked about, of work-home life balance. And when you work from home, those lines get a little bit more blurred. But if you can try to follow some routine daily that keeps you in kind of that same flow, although you're not going to be driving and commuting anymore, you can still do something, whether it's like working out, getting ready, and then going outside for a walk for a little bit, and just like doing something the same every day that makes it feel like you have that same thing happening. It helps kind of still distinguish those lines a little bit better while you're working from home, and that was helpful. I do think it takes time. I know some people that are working from home recently are probably still struggling a bit with it, and I would just say to give it some more time. Like, I think it took, when I first started working from home, and I have 3 young kids, 5 and under, and I think it took probably 2 to 3 months, honestly, to where like everybody was kind of on the same page, and my kids got an understanding of like, hey, dad's working, we don't go in and talk to him right now, but he'll come up for lunch and we can talk and hang out with him then or after work. And it took a little while to get kind of everybody used to that and knowing what that was going to be like every day, but it does definitely get better, and it was honestly a great experience working from home for a long time. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I will agree. It took us a good 2-3 months to get kind of back in or into a rhythm and into feeling like it was an okay thing to be doing.
Yeah, and you end up saving a lot of time commuting because that you don't think about it necessarily, but the overhead of that is quite high.
I mean, hopefully it won't be months upon months that we're working from home because of COVID-19, but even if it's not, it's some good things to learn about yourself and a good time to kind of experience something different. And you never know, your employer might decide that they like people being home. So
yeah, there's advantages and disadvantages to it. Depends on your situation.
Yeah, I mean, having asynchronous communication with chat tools like Slack has also been, like, utilizing those in the right ways when you're working from home can also be really beneficial. One thing I've really enjoyed too when I was working from home is we would set up a constant Google Hangout, like at a specific URL that we would, put in a channel description in Slack, that anybody that wanted to join that could hang out on there and work all day and just chat with everybody, or, speak up and unmute yourself and ask a question to somebody else. And it almost feels like you're really working together in the same room anyway, while you're really not. So that kind of stuff has been helpful for me in the past. And I've also been continuing to do that with my team now that we're all working from home, and a lot of them haven't experienced that before. We have we use Zoom now, so we have a daily Zoom link that just everybody joins and hangs out on throughout the day. And people join and leave as they go, as they're trying to go heads down or just kind of be involved with the rest of the team. But
yeah.
And if people want to give their any comments down in YouTube about it, we'd love to see what other people, found to be working for them now or in the past.
More questions too, because I'm sure people have lots of different ideas. If you're struggling with something, then go ahead, ask a question. Or if you know someone is struggling with something, we'll say that. If you have a friend who's struggling with something, then go ahead and put that in the comments, and we'll tell you at least what our ideas are.
We can now move on to Caden and his presentation.
Yeah, go ahead, Caden. Take it away.
Okay, I can just share my screen here. Let me get my. Oops. Let's see if I can. All right. Is that slides showing up? Hopefully.
Yep, there we go. I see it coming in.
Okay.
It should be visible for everybody here now.
All right. Awesome. Let me get going on this. So, yeah, I'm sorry about the awesome unfinished basement background, but you build your office where you can, and it's the best place I could right now. So, but yeah, so I am a little bit about me, a little intro. I am Caden Wilkinson. I am a mobile dev at Divi, which is located in Lehigh, Thanksgiving Point area. I've been working there since August 2018, so close a year and a half, 2 years almost. And I came from a background of doing native mobile development. I did mostly iOS previously, and then I also did get into Android quite a bit as well. But yeah, my background mostly been native development, and I am now currently doing React Native full-time at Divi. When I left Vivint Smart Home, doing iOS development for them, I jumped over and started doing React Native. And I mean, to be honest, I've really enjoyed the experience that I've had working on React Native. I know that it might not be the same for everybody, but for me, it's been actually a really great experience. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to, my presentation will go into, I want to keep things more along the native side of like how React Native works, just because that's what everybody's going to be familiar with here. And I will also focus on kind of Android side of things and what that interop looks like. With React Native and Android. And I'll talk a little bit about the architecture, and then I'll talk a little bit about, what is React. I'll just give you guys a brief intro about what React Native is and maybe why it would be something interesting that you would want to look at or consider. So yeah, so what is React Native? First of all, it's Facebook listed on their website for the documentation for React Native that it's a framework for building native apps using React. If you're not familiar with React, it is a web development framework that uses like this unidirectional kind of data flow pattern. It's like a declarative UI. You can think, Jetpack Compose, very similar paradigms to Jetpack Compose, but using JavaScript. And I think the Jetpack Compose, took a lot from the things that Facebook has learned with React and kind of brought a lot of those concepts and ideas to what that development workflow is like into Jetpack Compose, as well as Swift UI in the iOS world. So, yeah, so jumping in, like what are some of the benefits of React Native, and why would somebody, want to maybe look at using React Native for a project? One of the things that most people right out of the gate will understand is that it's seamless cross-platform. I will use seamless with a little bit of, you can take that with a grain of salt because nothing's ever perfect, and I'll probably get into a little bit about what the pain points are there with the cross-platform aspect, but for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward process for developing cross-platform apps on iOS and Android. I mean, currently at Divi, we have one single code base that runs on both iOS and Android. And the platform differences, the specific implementations for iOS and Android are very small in number compared to the total size of the project. So, and what does this mean about seamless cross-platform? Like, and a better description from the website on the docs. It says React components wrap existing native code and interact with native APIs via React's declarative UI paradigm and JavaScript. And this enables native app development for whole new teams of developers and can let existing native teams work much faster. And so over here there's a little diagram on the right that shows some JavaScript files and how those get laid out in a project and how you can easily implement something differently on iOS versus Android, you basically can have, so you have your normal like JavaScript files that you would define components in. And if you ever wanted to differentiate a component and how it renders on the iOS versus Android, it's as easy as creating two versions of the file with a .android .js on the end for the file extension for Android platform, and then .ios.js for iOS platform. And then you can easily have those two implementations decoupled per platform and have those work, specific to how those maybe platform paradigms would work. Because iOS and Android do have differences in, platform standards and user experience. And so there are cases where that is, a good idea so that your users are more familiar with user experience on that platform. So another benefit to React Native is the concept of fast refresh. Most people have probably heard the term hot reloading. Fast refresh is basically a newer version. So there was in React Native, there's a concept of hot reloading and live reloading. And those were two different things, but it was kind of confusing as to what the difference between those were. And so recently React Native converged on merging those two experiences into one concept they call fast refresh, which is basically still just hot reloading, where you can, edit files, save, and see the changes immediately. And I have a little video on a loop here that will show kind of what that experience looks like, that will just, I'll kind of narrate as it's going. But you'll notice that there's like an emulator or simulator on the right, and then we've got the code on the left, and we're making changes here. And this is currently not valid JavaScript code because those semicolons need to be commas. And we see that as you're making changes and reloading, hey, there's problems showing up on the screen and saving, and hey, we fixed all the errors and now it's starting to render. Okay, let's change the layout a bit. There we go. Let's go and add a component here that we didn't have previously to add an action. Okay, well, we didn't import this component, so there's a problem. Let's go up top and import that component. Let's save that. Hey, component's there. Now let's go make some changes to this component. Use primary label. Add a label to our button here. And then we'll save after we make this change, see what happens. Yeah, don't think too much about like this code and what it looks like, because it's probably pretty foreign, but just the fact that you can make changes, save, see errors in the simulator, fix those errors, save, reload, boom, changes are there. No build cycle, no, waiting for Android Studio Xcode, Gradle like builds to see most of your stylistic changes. You can iterate on those as quickly as you can basically edit code, which has been a fantastic experience for me.
Yeah, that looks pretty cool.
Yeah, so this is honestly, and I will say the experience here has gotten even better than when I first started using it a year and a half ago. There was a lot of things that were like this reloading experience isn't perfect. I wouldn't say still either. There's some cases where it still will have to reload the whole app. And like if you're working on a screen that's nested down in some view hierarchy, or like navigation stack, then sometimes when you reload, you'll have to navigate through the app back to the screen that you're working on. That still happens every once in a while. I wouldn't say it's as often as it was a year and a half ago, but it's definitely much better than it was previously. And just the time that I can iterate and make changes to UI is leaps and bounds faster than I ever was able to when I was doing iOS or Android. I know you have like storyboards and layouts in Android Studio and in Xcode where you can kind of see those changes live before you actually run. But some people don't actually recommend using storyboards on iOS or whatnot, and so there's sometimes where you have to do layouts at a programmatic level, and this just combines those two experiences into one. So all your layout is code, and you can also see it instantaneously without requiring to build. So kind of best of both worlds, in my opinion. Okay, so let me move on from that. Another benefit is performance. I know that this is probably something that a lot of people from the native community would try to say isn't necessarily a benefit. But I would say compared to other solutions that offer cross-platform experience, performance is is really great. Some of the other options for cross-platform app, you could do some kind of hybrid, basically just like web-based HTML straight up. You could also do, there's Flutter, which does have a decent level of performance as well. There's also the native level cross-platform with like Xamarin and C#, which also is at a native level, so great performance. But most people associate React Native with JavaScript, and they think that means really poor performance, just because you're not as close to the metal as like a compiled language down into a binary, right? Where you have a JavaScript run interpreted language like at runtime. But let me see. Yeah, so one of the descriptions from their doc says React Native lets you create truly native apps and doesn't compromise on your user's experience. It provides a core set of platform agnostic native components like view, text, and image that map directly to the platform's native UI building blocks. And I think this is where the real beauty of React Native comes in is, with nothing against Flutter. I think Flutter is a great tool, but one of the differences between React Native and Flutter is that the rendering engine for Flutter is completely custom built, and so like the components that you're actually rendering in Flutter aren't the actual like native Android iOS UI components. They're basically imitations or copies of those components, made to look as close to the real thing as possible so that it feels as real. Whereas React Native is actually rendering those native UI components behind the scenes. So when you're rendering a text input in React Native, it's actually, a UI text field on iOS, or text. I guess it would be a text field or text input on Android. But yeah, it's literally those native building blocks. And if an image in React Native is being rendered, it's a UI image on iOS. So the great thing that comes with that is, the text editing experience in a React Native app is the same as an actual completely native app, because you are using the native, text input components. So selection, highlighting text, dragging cursor around, all that stuff is exactly like a native app, feels like a native app because it is native. Although the view hierarchy is being rendered in JavaScript, that gets translated into native components by React Native. So the next step is like, how does React Native accomplish all of these things? How do they build this UI framework that works across platform, that has really good performance? How does this stuff work? There's really great articles from a company called Formidable, link at the bottom of the slide. I also try to post the slides as like a PDF in the Slack channel after. But yeah, this has a link to a really great series of blog posts. There's 4 parts to it. This is from the first part. And there's this great diagram about the architecture of React Native and how this works. And so, oh, sweet, you can see my mouse, great. So yeah, this top piece, we've got React here, which is like basically the JavaScript kind of web framework. And it's built on top of JavaScript. And in React Native, there's this concept of the JSC, which stands for JavaScript Core, which, if you're familiar with iOS, JavaScript Core is the JavaScript engine that ships with iOS. And that project, though, is also cross-platform. And so there's been some awesome work by Facebook teams and other teams to support the JavaScript Core on Android as well. So React Native basically used this JavaScript core to interpret all the JavaScript that's running on Android. There is a newer project that was recently announced last year called Hermes, which was a brand new JavaScript engine created by Facebook specifically for React Native on Android that gives some really awesome performance benefits over the JavaScript core. I won't go into too much detail there, but if you're curious, go check that out. And then there's this concept called the bridge, which is probably the piece I'll be talking about the most. And the way that this works is you're writing this UI code that's declarative in JavaScript, and you're rendering what's called normally in the web you'd call it the DOM, right? And in this case, React Native would call it like the shadow tree. It's like the view hierarchy of like what these components are and how they're ordered, and parent-child relationships, and how it's all laid out. And you basically render this tree, and then you send it from the JavaScript world across this bridge to the native side. And then the native side takes this tree, compares it to what it's previously rendered on the screen, basically what the tree was before, and performs like this diff of the previous state of the UI and what the state is currently being rendered as. And then it understands, hey, there's a difference here. This specific property was changed. And then it basically goes through and updates all of those native UI components with those new properties that have changed since the last render, and then renders those onto the screen. And it's basically this loop of, hey, here's the UI being rendered. Let's compare it to what was rendered before. If anything changed, let's re-render it. And the great thing about this is that the React Native and like React itself is controlling the rendering of all the UI for you. And also, like, you just render the changes with the state that you've received and how the UI changes based on that. And then the framework figures out what needs to actually change in the UI for you. You don't have to think about, hey, I got to go update this label on this button component, and here I go. Here, this is how I go do that. You just say, hey, here's my button. Here's what its label is. And if it ever changes, then the framework will just update it for you. And I think this removes a lot of overhead as to how you think about development when you're building like a UI, because like in the iOS, native world and Android, you basically, you're receiving events or like methods that get called that then need to perform changes and update the UI, and all of that is like completely manual. And you're having to go, update text labels, layouts, and you're basically manage all of that state yourself. And that's where I think React Native has been an amazing experience for me, is I don't have to think about that piece anymore. I just think about what should the UI look like in this specific state that I have right now. What should it look like? And then the framework figures out the rest. So the other pieces to this architecture is that there on this bridge we have this native modules piece. It's very easy to go and implement any features at the native level that you need to, which is also a really great benefit, because there are platform differences. There's times where you need to dive into the native level and implement some feature because React Native maybe doesn't support it because it's a fairly rare thing to need to do. It's not a common use case. And so I'm actually going to go through an example of like what that would look like specifically in Kotlin on Android, like creating a native module and how React Native would like bridge that or cross that bridge. The other piece to note is that this bridge is completely asynchronous. So when you're sending data from the JavaScript world over to native, you're doing that with like the intention that, hey, I might get a response back, but because it's asynchronous, you can't guarantee that, right? There's this great quote from this article that this diagram came from. It says, the key aspect of the current architecture is that the two realms, JavaScript and native, are not really aware of each other. This means that to communicate, they rely on asynchronous JSON messages transmitted across the bridge. These are sent to the native code with the expectation, but not a guarantee, that they will elicit a response sometime in the future. And this is also a unique way to think about, creating cross-platform code in a native module, because you're sending a message across and expecting to get a response back, but you can't guarantee that. And this has probably been one of the biggest pain points in React Native, which is actually why they are going through a large re-architecture of React Native and the platform and the framework as a whole, which is actually what these articles that these come from is about. Is it talks about the new React Native architecture. And so if you're interested, go check those articles out. It'll go into detail about like what kind of things are changing in React Native to help make synchronous communication between JavaScript and native possible, which is a really cool concept. Being able to have a dynamic language like JavaScript call into native code synchronously and get a response back, which will also have some really great benefits for performance as well, which is going to be awesome. So and I always bring this up just for those that aren't super familiar with asynchronous, programming or code. Just think of Slack, asynchronous communication tool, right? You send somebody a message, you might get a response back, you might not. Same concept with sending stuff across the bridge to the native world from React Native. So, okay, so the bridge, how does it work? breaking down the bridge. So it uses a couple of concepts from the JavaScript world called, you may be familiar with this there's, I think, some other frameworks that on iOS and Android as well to support promises. But it's basically, or this async await concept. It's basically a way to say, hey, I am going to perform this action and I'm going to return a promise that I will give you some kind of result, whether it's a success or a failure. And here's kind of what that looks like in JavaScript code. So you would have a function that takes a parameter that's async, and then you do some native asynchronous thing and await the response on that and get a result. So this is one way that we can do things asynchronously across that bridge in React Native. Another option is that we can use something called callbacks, where you're passing a function as a parameter that can get called at a later time. So for example, here's a function that takes one parameter and then a callback, and we do some native asynchronous thing, and then when we get that asynchronous result back, we then call the callback with that result. So those are kind of two ways that you can pass the data from the back and forth between those two worlds across that asynchronous bridge. Okay, so I want to jump into an example of what this would actually look like if you wanted to implement some kind of native module. And so I created this volume tester example project, where from our React Native side of our code, we're writing all JavaScript. We want to be able to call into our native code and mute the volume on the device, get the current volume, increase the volume, and decrease the volume. So let's go through and see what that would look like. And some vocabulary around the bridge and Android specifically. Keep in mind, I designed this presentation previously for React Native crowd, and some of them were a lot of web devs. So I even threw in Java so they could be aware of what that is. But I know you guys are probably fine there. Kotlin, and then there's this concept of a React context-based Java module, and this is basically the interface that you'll be extending to implement a native module for React Native. So here's an implementation in Kotlin of a volume module. It takes a React context, that's a React application context as a parameter, and then inherits this React context-based Java module, forwarding that React context into it. And then we override this function to get a name and describe what the name of this module is going to be. And that will actually end up being the name that gets exposed to the JavaScript code. So yeah. And then obviously we have annotations on Android and in the Java JVM world. There's a couple of annotations used by React Native to make this bridge as seamless as possible, one of them being React method. And so what we can do is we can just add methods now to this module and annotate them with React method. And now this method is exposed to the JavaScript world to be able to call it, which is super awesome, super easy. We can also create a method that takes a callback. What would that look like? Again, we define a method, current volume, that is annotated with React method, and takes a callback parameter that's of type callback. And inside of this volume, we can call this callback whenever we need to pass a message response back to the JavaScript world by calling invoke on that callback. Fairly straightforward. And then we could also use a promise if we wanted to, where similar to callback, rather than taking a callback parameter, you can just pass a promise. And then you could resolve that promise in your method from the native side, and that would pass the response back to the JavaScript world. Okay, so the next thing is that, so we have the concept of a module, which kind of encapsulates all of the functionality for this specific native feature. And then what we do is we create a React package that basically makes it easy for any kind of application to add this package or this native module to their application or for other React Native projects. And so we create a volume package that inherits from React package. We can ignore the create view managers because it's just returning an empty list, because we're not really doing anything with views in this case. We're just doing stuff by touching the volume. And then we create this create native modules overridden function that takes in the React context, and adds our native module to the list of native modules for the specific package. So a package could have multiple native modules that kind of wrap up a bunch of functionality and then kind of packages them up, hence the name package. And then somebody could use, all of those native modules that are bundled up in that package. And how do we add that package? So in React Native, there's like a main application Java or Kotlin file, and we basically just have a get packages method that we override and return a list of packages. And all we have to do is just call packages add, passing in that volume package. And there we go. We now have access to this in our JavaScript code. It's been exposed through the bridge now. So here's a, this is an actual TypeScript. So you'll see some types here rather than JavaScript. A lot of React Native developers use TypeScript just because they like having a compiler with more strict typing, because we're familiar with that world. Since we come from the native dev world, it just makes sense to have a compiler. So yeah, so this is using TypeScript, and here we go. We just implement a class volume manager in JavaScript, implement a bunch of methods, and we import this native modules package from React Native, which is how all of those magic packages get exposed to React Native. So in the mute, we can just call native modules volume module to grab that module that was registered and call a method mute on it. Same with current volume. We reach into the volume module, call current volume, passing in our callback that will get called, passing in that number value, and then increment volume, rather than doing a callback, uses a promise. And so here we return that promise to whoever is calling us, our JavaScript increment volume method. And that's literally the entire process to create a native module in React Native and to be able to call into native code from JavaScript. It's fairly straightforward. I would say iOS is quite a bit more complicated, especially if you were wanting to use Swift, because React Native is built on top of the Objective-C runtime, which Swift has to support but doesn't necessarily have really good support for. And so there's a lot of Objective-C code you have to write for at least native modules on iOS. You can also wrap those in like a Swift wrapper as well if you want to end up writing the majority of your code in Swift. But yeah, to the extent that's all it takes to basically cross that bridge, create code on the native side, which goes to show you that you don't have to create an entire app greenfield with React Native. You could easily embed a few screens or whatever here and there. There's definitely lots of brownfield projects that use React Native, and you don't have to necessarily go all in React Native, but you can also implement bits and pieces of your app in React Native, and it actually works out pretty well. So let's see, how am I doing on time? 6:43. Okay, so
I've got a question for you, Caden.
Yeah.
So you mentioned before that not only just JavaScript, but you can use TypeScript. And what are the other options that you have, like CoffeeScript or?
I would say the two biggest ones are Flow, which is a type-safe layer on top of JavaScript that was created by Facebook, and React Native, all of its JavaScript code is actually implemented using Flow. And so if you used Flow, you would kind of get really good support for getting up-to-date type definitions for all of your code that you're using, since that's what Facebook's using. However, I've seen that most of the community in React Native seem to be using TypeScript over Flow. Most third-party libraries that are getting developed and published as packages that you can consume, most of them provide TypeScript definitions for all of their code rather than Flow. And I wouldn't be surprised if Facebook started moving away from Flow at some point in the near future and moving towards TypeScript. I know that Microsoft is going all in on TypeScript, and they're also going all in on React Native, which is pretty interesting. I'll show a couple more slides on Microsoft with React Native as well. But yeah, I would say those are really the two main options, TypeScript or Flow, that I see out in the wild, other than just raw JavaScript. But
Okay.
So, who is using React Native? I should have put Divi on here, but larger companies using React Native. Obviously, Facebook that created it, and then Microsoft. I actually was going to add a few more. I didn't get to it. I'll just give them to you here. But if anybody's aware of Wix, they are that web design company where you can, build websites with like a what you see is what you get WYSIWYG editor on the web. Their mobile app all uses React Native, and they actually have a really fantastic library in React Native that most people or a lot of apps use, including us, for navigation. So Wix has been a popular one. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Artsy. Artsy is an open source by default company, so all of their mobile apps and software development happens out in the open, publicly on GitHub. They did a lot of like native iOS Swift development on their apps, and they've gone all in on React Native for the last couple years now. And so that's been a pretty cool project to follow. They have really good blog articles about what they've liked about React Native. Another big company using React Native, which might surprise some people, is Discord. So the chat server kind of competitor to Slack, but for gamers, which is an app that I would say probably needs really good performance when you're doing live chat apps, and their app is fantastic, and they are using React Native on or they've gone all in on React Native as well. I'm trying to think what other big companies using React Native. I'm sure there's some more, but yeah, those are kind of the ones I can think of right now. So just some information about Facebook and Microsoft using React Native. So an employee from Facebook posted this poll on Twitter asking, people how many full screens they think are built with React Native at Facebook. And here's kind of the breakdown of what the responses were. It'd be interesting to see what everybody else on this call kind of thinks. Maybe I'll give you a sec to try to post in the chat before I show you the answer for just a sec. Okay. All right, I'm just going to move forward now. Correct answer is 750 plus. So Facebook is using 450 React Native screens in the actual Facebook app and 300 plus in other apps like Instagram, Ads Manager, and their Oculus app, and some other smaller apps that they've got out there. Which to me that's a pretty large scale React Native used in production by a company that large, which is pretty cool. Let's see. Okay. Is that all I have for Facebook? I guess that was. So yeah, Facebook team, real quick. Facebook's team is been pretty awesomely involved with the community. They're always open to feedback. Everything happens out in the open. I've actually contributed a couple of times. React Native, pretty small changes, but it's been a pretty great experience, and things have just been constantly getting better over time. Some of the things that were implemented on Android were kind of outdated. We were using like really old versions of like Android, like great old dependencies and like build tools, and those all got updated in the last year or two. So we're like up on the latest now. We now have a new JavaScript engine that adds great performance on Android. One other great thing to mention, benefit to using React Native that we've seen is the ability to do over-the-air updates, which has been fantastic. Because your code is JavaScript, you can deploy new JavaScript updates over the air, and your app can detect those when it launches, download those in the background, and then the next time the app launches, they can basically replace that newly downloaded version and launch that, which is really great. It allows us to iterate and release updates without having to go through, like we usually do this for just small bug fixes and updates. Not usually we've not like huge, like if you're doing native changes, you have to go through, submit a new native binary through, App Store, App Review, and then Google Play Store. But if you're just doing just minor JavaScript changes, or even if you just built a smaller feature that's just purely in JavaScript, we can release those over the air. which allows your users to get updates even quicker because they don't have to update a native app. It just happens as they use it, which is pretty cool. In fact, we were using that recently to deploy a version back to older versions, prompting people to update because of a security issue, which we wouldn't have been able to do. We wouldn't have been able to go back to an old version and like tell users, hey, you should probably update because there's a security problem or whatever. But we were able to do that, and that's been a really awesome thing to be able to do.
Yeah, that seems pretty cool.
All right. So Microsoft has been doing amazing things with React Native. In fact, they have forked the React Native project and created a React Native for Windows and Mac. So if I just jump on this link really quick, take you guys over here. Here's the React Native for Windows and Mac project from Microsoft. Here's an example of, hey, here's some React code, and here's a native Windows app rendering all of that. And then they've got status and roadmap, and it looks like the Mac stuff is actually in progress. I'm guessing it's built on top of the new cross-platform kind of stuff that Apple's been doing with UIKit. And yeah, so this has been a pretty cool project to watch. One thing that's interesting to note is they had a presentation at React Native EU conference in Europe, and they showed this chart where you have your universal Windows. I don't know what P stands for. Universal Windows Program something. But this is like your normal native Windows app using C++ and C#. You got Electron over here on the right, and this is like performance progress. I would say there was another chart that they showed like memory usage, and it was very similar to this chart as well. But yeah, here's like your React Native for Windows, and then they have this vNext version that they're working on right now and how that improves performance. But just noticing the actual performance is a lot closer to an actual native application built in C++ and C# than it is to Electron, which is basically a web app embedded into like a native app container. So it's more of like a hybrid approach, but just noticing the big difference in performance there is pretty awesome. Same with like memory usage, a lot less memory usage than like an Electron type app versus native. So, and that comes from a YouTube video. I also got a link down here from their presentation as well if you're curious to look into that some more. And that is all of the slides that I have prepared, and we're actually pretty close to 7. So we got a few minutes for me to answer some questions. Which I can stop sharing my screen real quick.
Yeah, there were a few questions in the stream. Let's see. So here's one of them. Were you just using VS Code and an extension for displaying the preview? That was one of them.
So I'm assuming they're talking about like the UI where you're getting like the hot reloading that was showing on the side. That's actually running on either a device or an emulator or simulator, like Android emulator, iOS simulator. So it's not actually an extension just showing a preview. You're actually rendering the actual app on a device, and the hot reloading works just that good on a device, not with just a preview. So
cool. Also, let's see if this is another one you can look at. Yeah, the newest libraries from Android, if it's compatible with those.
Yeah, so we just recently migrated over to all the Android X dependencies. That was one of the big pushes that they made that kind of brought our Android stuff up to par with the rest of the Android world. So yeah, I would say as of lately, yes, React Native supports like all the latest stuff with Android X dependencies, Jetpack, all of that stuff as well.
Cool. That's all that I see from the feed, unless you see others, Jen. Or
looks like there's a question about Flutter as good as React Native.
That's true.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I have a lot of experience with Flutter. I have very limited experience. I have a coworker that I worked with in the past that has been doing a lot of Flutter development, Dustin Graham, for those that know him. And he's been really loving that experience as well. I think the dev tooling experience for Dart and Flutter is really awesome. And I think that they were leaps and bounds ahead of where React Native was probably a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. I do think React Native's dev experience has been catching up. But also there's, pros and cons to both. I would say that I wouldn't say one's better than the other. I think it just depends on, what kind of app you're going to be working on. One of the things I always refer to with React Native is like, when is it a good choice to use React Native? And I always give the example that if your app is basically going to be a pretty JSON parser that basically takes data from a server, displays it, maybe gives you the ability to make some changes to that data and send requests to update it and mutate it. If that's all your app's really going to be doing, you're not going to be diving in and doing any crazy like native stuff like, video streaming or, implementing like lots of native like app extensions, that kind of thing. Those things are totally possible in React Native. I just wouldn't say that they're as easy, or they might be a little more tricky to do, but I would say that most apps I see out there fall under the bucket of just being a pretty JSON parser. You take data, show it, be able to change it. And so it's a really great use case for a lot of things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you touched on Electron already a little bit.
Yeah, so Electron is not native. I mean, it's basically just web. It's web-based. You're rendering HTML, JavaScript, just like a website. You're just embedding that into a native app container so that it looks kind of like a native app, but really it's just running like Chrome behind the scenes, running a web app. That's basically what Electron is. Versus React Native is rendering like this UI tree of what it should be rendered as. And then that gets translated into actual native UI components, not like HTML web-based components, but UI text fields, UI view, all that stuff. So it's actually being rendered natively.
Okay, one last one here has to do with Bluetooth, which is more of a native kind of thing.
Yeah, I actually know somebody as well that has been doing a React Native app that did some Bluetooth work. They were actually working on an app to help set up like a Wi-Fi router, and they were able to build that in React Native. And maybe they probably had to build like a native module to help interact with Bluetooth. But yeah, like I showed, it's not too crazy to really create a native module when you need to dive in and use some native APIs that aren't exposed to JavaScript already. And so it's definitely completely possible to do those exact kind of things as well.
Cool. Well, I think that's everything from questions, and there may be more questions later on the live feed or comments on the video as it's posted to the channel. But thanks again, Caden and John and Jennifer, for helping out today. Yeah, any final thoughts from you or from any of you on the chat here?
I would just say, well, thank you guys. Appreciate you letting me come on and do the presentation. Happy to do some more stuff about it in the future as well. If there's anything people want to learn more about specifically. I would just say that anybody that's curious to dive in to learn anything about React Native, I'd probably start with just touching React a little bit on the web, just to get a feel for what that paradigm and development experience is like, because it's quite a bit different than the native world. And then once you do that, there's a great project called Expo, which I can also just post here in the chat probably. And that basically, Expo is a project that allows you to get up and running a lot faster with React Native than trying to spin up Android Studio and Xcode. And it's honestly, I would say it's basically been built for people that come from the React world and the web world that aren't super familiar with like native mobile app workflows. But here, I don't know if I can actually comment in here. It doesn't look like I can paste a comment, but
oh, you're in the private chat. If you go to the comments, it should show up. Or maybe not. No, that's.
I don't think so. It doesn't look like it, but anyway, it's expo expo.io is what it is. So I can even throw it on. I'll just create a last slide with some links that I'll put in the PDF that I throw on Slack, and find it there too. So see. I'm just curious. Was there numbers on the stream? How many people did we have in attendance?
Just a handful right now.
Okay.
So you had a last page of links. You said you wanted to share, Caden.
No, sorry. When I generate the PDF to go post it on the Slack group, I'll just add a last page that has some resources and links that people can grab from the PDF for the slides.
Okay. All right, sounds good. Well, thanks again, and I think we'll sign off here. But I appreciate all of your hard work and the slides and all the information you presented. And thanks, John and Jennifer, for your comments as well. All right, we'll see you next time then.
Thank you. See you next month.
That's right. All right, thanks, Caden.
Yep, thank you.